Welcome back. Last week we arrived at a precise theoretical vocabulary for how advantage works in virtual spaces. Capital, in its economic, cultural and social forms, accumulates through play, confers structural position, and critically does not stay inside the game. What happens inside a field is real. What is produced there can cross borders, and the mechanism preventing people from seeing this is misrecognition. This week we press on that crossing directly. We're asking, what is value in a virtual world? How does it get made? How does it circulate, and what happens when it moves? These questions bear directly on all three threads we've been tracking. The boundary question. If value crosses between virtual and real, the boundary is not just porous in identity terms but in economic terms, which means the ordinary rules that govern real-world economies already apply here, whether or not anyone has decided they should. The assumed player question. Who gets to be a producer in these economies? Whose production counts, and who controls the laws of physics that determine what is worth producing? And the play-work question, which this week comes into focus for the first time as an economic problem rather than a philosophical one. If virtual labour produces real value, then does playing become working? And what are the consequences of that distinction? The readings, Burke's 2002 paper on early MMO economies and Malaby's Parlaying Value from 2006 give us two angles. Burke's maps the economics from the inside. He's a historian trying to understand who these players are and what they're actually doing. Malaby gives us the theoretical framework to make sense of what Burke describes, drawing on Bourdieu to show how the forms of value generated in virtual worlds are not sealed off from the rest of social life. Together they make an argument that is still underappreciated in its implications. That virtual economies are real economies, that they generate real stakes, and that the people participating in them are doing something that matters beyond the game. So, let's start with Burke. The opening scene of Burke's paper is a moment that we should sit with. It's patch day in Asheron's call, where in 2001, in the early generation of massively multiplayer online games, when monthly subscription fees and persistent virtual worlds were still genuinely novel. Players have logged on with anticipation. New content, new tools, new tricks. And then the Greta Shadow armour, the most coveted personal protection in the game, acquired through weeks or months of grinding, is nerfed overnight. Its power is dramatically reduced without warning. Forums are exploding and players are furious. But Burke notices something specific in the fury. These players aren't just angry because their armour is weaker. They're angry because the rules changed without their consent. Because someone with absolute power over the environment in which they've invested hundreds of hours just reached down from on high and rewrote the laws of physics. And this, Burke argues, is what makes virtual economies fundamentally different from any other kind of economy. The developer, the company that makes and runs the game, occupies a position that has no real equivalent in the non-virtual world. Governments regulate economies. Corporations shape them from within. But no human institution has quite the degree of direct control over the physical laws of the environment in which economic activity takes place. In Asheron's call, in EverQuest, and in Ultima Online, a small group of developers can decide overnight that iron is worth twice what it was yesterday, or that the most powerful sword in the game is now obsolete, or that an entire region of the game world no longer exists. They're not powerful economic actors operating within the system, they are the authors of the system itself. Burke calls this a deity-like arrangement. Players understand developers as something like a government, an authority they can petition, lobby, complain about, organise against, but unlike any government in the real world, developers have something approaching absolute control over what he calls the laws of physics of the world they've created. There is a direct line back to winner here. The developers of Asheron calls are not just technically powerful actors operating within an existing social world. They are the architects of the world's laws, the people whose design decisions function, as Winner would say, like legislative acts, but within a degree of direct control no real-world legislature could approach. They're not powerful actors within the system, they are the authors of the system itself, and like Moses' bridge, the politics built into those laws is not always legible as politics. It looks like how the game works, it looks like physics. The rubicite breastplate that gives the paper its title was an item in EverQuest, once so powerful and desirable that it became the effective basis of an unofficial currency, traded and held as a store of value in its own right. Then the developers decided it was unbalanced and changed it. Overnight, the rubicite economy collapsed. The developers, Burke writes, functions as arbiters of the world's laws, in a way that has no real-world equivalent. They are simultaneously the invisible hand of the market and the government passing the regulations, with the power to change the laws of gravity whenever they see fit. This is the foundational insight of Burke's paper, and it frames everything that follows. These are not just games, they are, in his terms, social simulations, and more precisely, uncontrolled experiments in how economies work when you remove or radically alter the usual constraints. And to understand what's happening in these experiments, you need to understand the actors inside them. So Burke identifies three distinct economic populations within these early MMOs. Three different ways of positioning oneself in relation to the virtual economy. He acknowledges their ideal types in the Weberian sense, like Max Weber. He's not saying every player falls neatly into one bin, but the taxonomy is analytically useful because it maps the underlying logics at work, and because it identifies tensions that are more than just personality conflicts. They're genuine conflicts between incompatible visions of what the game is for. The first group he calls utility-maximisers, what we probably call today power gamers or min-maxers. These players behave exactly as homo economicus, the figure at the centre of neoclassical economics, relentless seekers of the most efficient path to the most valuable outcome with the minimum expenditure of effort. In Asheron's call, maximisers identify which monsters produce the best experience to risk ratio and converge on them in enormous numbers, collectively stripping the most profitable areas of the game. If a new character build is discovered that is marginally more effective than the current optimal template, the pure maximiser simply abandons a character they've spent months developing and starts over with the new one. Sentiment is irrelevant. Sentiment is irrelevant. The game is a competition. The metric is measurable achievement and the goal is domination. Burke gives a particularly sharp example. In Asheron's call, the game awards the majority of experience for a kill to the player who does 51% of total damage. So some maximisers developed a skill called skimming, doing just over half the damage to a monster and moving on, leaving other players to deal with the remainder and collect only the scraps of experience. Pure rational self-interest. It also generated enormous social friction. And that friction is precisely where the second economic population enters. The second group Burke calls the moral economy faction, a smaller group but disproportionately vocal and influential within these communities. The name draws on a tradition in economic anthropology, the moral economy, which refers to situations where people believe that economic transactions should be governed by social and cultural norms that precede and transcend the logic of the marketplace. E.P. Thompson used the term to analyse 18th century bread riots in England. The rioters weren't simply hungry, they were asserting that grain had to be sold at a fair price within the local community before being exported for profit, regardless of what the market said. The moral economy players in these MMOs are making an analogous argument. The foundational question for them isn't what's the optimal strategy, it's is this fun? For them, the maximiser's algorithmic efficiency is more like work than leisure. Many of them are role players. They have elaborate backstories for their characters. They explore the game world for its own sake. They maintain small sub-communities and spend hours in conversation that have no economic payoff whatsoever. From the maximiser's perspective, this is hopelessly suboptimal. From the moral economy player's perspective, the maximiser is ruining the world. Burke makes an observation that I want to flag as more subtle than it might appear. The tension between these groups isn't just a difference of personality or playing style. It's a conflict between two visions of what the community should be. A tension between what he calls civic communitarianism and the extreme individualism of the free market ethos. The moral economy players are arguing, in effect, that the moral economy players are arguing, in effect, that the game should function more like a commons, a shared space governed by norms of mutual obligation and reciprocity, not pure competitive extraction. This is a genuine political argument, and it's one that tends to lose slowly and consistently in the face of the optimizing logic that maximisers bring to the game. The third group, exploiters, is the most difficult to describe because they operate in secret. They include players who take advantage of software bugs for economic gain, players who use third-party automation program like the WoW Glider in Consalvo's paper to grind experience overnight without actually being present, and most notoriously the eBay sellers who trade virtual items or entire accounts for real money outside the game. It's this last practice that Burke finds most analytically revealing, because the eBay seller puts the maximiser in an unexpectedly ironic position. Maximisers have spent hundreds of hours building powerful characters through legitimate effort and competitive skill. They understand this investment as leisure, as play, even if an intensely competitive form of it. The eBay seller has found a shortcut. Real-world money can purchase what previously required the investment of virtual labour, and the maximiser's response is to invoke a moral economy argument. The eBay seller is cheating, is corrupting the game, is undermining the value of genuine achievement. They sound, in other words, exactly like the role players they would normally dismiss. Burke's formulation, eBay sales completely invert the time-wealth equation. Without such sales, wealthy and powerful characters would usually be produced by people with the most real-world time to expend. But with such sales, people with little time but lots of money are effectively able to purchase the labour time of maximisers. The eBay farmer makes legible the labour-like quality of maximising. It attaches a price tag to what the maximiser has understood as play, and that for the maximiser is genuinely disturbing, because it reveals something they would prefer not to see about the nature of what they've been doing. There's a conclusion to Burke's argument that I want to single out, because it connects directly to Malaby's framework and to the question of what we're really talking about when we talk about value. Even in the most ruthlessly optimised communities, even in communities where the dominant ethos is competitive extraction and measurable achievement, Burke finds a deeper layer. The last achievement, the thing that ultimately motivates even the pure optimiser, is reputation among peers. Cultural standing, the respect of the community, a maximiser who turns up with mismatched armour or who exhibits beginner level errors in a high stakes encounter loses something that their accumulated wealth cannot replace. As Burke puts it, even a player at the most reductionistic extreme of the game still plays it because it is a more fun way to make status than anything else available to them. The final level of moral economy, in other words, is always relational. It's always about what you mean to other people. This is precisely where Malaby's theoretical framework becomes indispensable, because what Burke has observed is the simultaneously circulation of different forms of value within a virtual world. Material value, yes, but also social value and also cultural value. And what Malaby's contribution makes possible is a precise account of how those forms relate to each other, and crucially, how they cross boundaries. So Malaby's 2006 paper, Parlaying Value, draws directly on Bourdieu's theory of capital to argue that virtual worlds are domains where three distinct forms of value are generated and circulated. and where those forms can be converted from one into another and transferred from the game world into the wider social world. His key conceptual move is to replace virtual world or game with the term domain, a semi-bounded arena for action where certain conventional expectations apply and certain resources may be available. So this is not a magic circle. Domains are not set apart from everyday life. Their boundaries with each other are practical, not fundamental. They're permeable. Things leak. And the crucial implication is what happens in a domain is real in the same sense that what happens anywhere is real, and that the forms of value produced within it can, under the right conditions, be moved. The first form is material capital. Gold, items, equipment, characters, things with direct market value. This is what Casanova calculated when he worked out the GDP of EverQuest. Burke's maximisers are primary producers of this form, and the eBay market is what happens when material capital generated inside the game is exchanged for material capital outside it. The second form is social capital. The networks of relationships, obligations and trust that players build through sustained participation, guild membership, the mutual dependence of a raid group, the reputation that follows a player from server to server or from game to game. This is the capital that Moral Economy faction is primarily invested in. Networks of reciprocal obligation that make the game meaningful as a social world, and that the maximisers are seen as degrading. The third form, and for Malaby the most analytically interesting, is cultural capital. The competencies, credentials and expertise players develop through deep engagement. The embodied knowledge of game mechanics. The skills that allow execution of a complex fight without conscious thought. The status that comes from being recognisably, demonstrably good at the game in ways that other players can observe and verify. For Bourdieu, cultural capital is the most fungible, most easily moved across contexts, because it is not attached to objects or networks but to persons. Malaby's central argument is that all three forms are not sealed off from each other, but not sealed off from the domains outside the game. They're mutually convertible. Social capital generates material capital. A well-connected guild can farm loot more efficiently, which can be exchanged. Cultural capital generates social capital. Expertise attracts followers, builds reputation, opens doors. And all three can be parlayed, transferred, converted across the boundary between the game world and the world outside it. The word parlay comes from gambling. To stake your winnings from one bet to another. What Malaby is arguing is that players in virtual worlds are constantly doing exactly this. They're taking capital accumulated in one domain and betting it in another. And this is not a metaphor. The capital is real. The stakes are real. The conversions happen. So 2 examples will make this vivid, and both of them involve attempting to use game-related cultural capital for purposes outside the game. The first is Elon Musk's Diablo and Path of Exile episode from earlier this year. Musk claimed publicly to be dominating the leaderboards in 2 demanding RPGs, games that require hundreds of hours of meticulous character building, optimization, and deeply embodied mechanical skill. He live-streamed himself playing. The gaming community immediately identified that he was making errors no genuine high-ranked player would make. Leaked communications suggested he had been account boosting, paying professional players to build his character to a competitive rank, then taking over. This is a textbook Malaby case study in failed parlay. What Musk was attempting was a conversion, taking his economic and political capital and using it to generate cultural capital in a domain where money doesn't work that way. The entire value of being a genuinely skilled gamer, what Malaby would call the game's legitimate indeterminacy, is that the cultural capital can only be earned through the effort that produces the competence. You cannot purchase the credential without purchasing the skill. The attempt backfired. Instead of generating cultural capital, it exposed the absence of it. and that exposure converted directly into exactly the kind of reputational damage that the gaming credentials were supposed to offset. The second case works in the opposite direction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Among Us Twitch stream in October 2020 was a parlay that largely worked. She logged on with prominent streamers in the run-up to the presidential election and played Among Us, a game that had become genuinely culturally significant during COVID for several hours. She was demonstrably competent. She was clearly enjoying herself. She made the kind of jokes that land inside gaming culture, and she directed viewers towards voter registration resources throughout. What AOC was doing was converting cultural capital, being legibly a new kind of politician, someone who inhabits internet culture without performing it, into political capital, specifically voter mobilization. The parlay worked because the underlying asset was real. The gaming engagement wasn't a strategy grafted onto her public persona from outside. The cultural capital was genuine, and so the conversion was credible. The contrast between these two cases is a precise illustration of Malaby's central claim. Capital parlayed across domains only converts successfully if the original asset is genuine. And the thing that makes cultural capital in gaming genuine, the indeterminacy that Malaby keeps returning to, is that it cannot be faked without detection. So when you log into your game this week, I want you to think about these three forms of capital operating simultaneously throughout the world you're entering. What's the material economy? Who controls the most of it? How was it accumulated? Is there a rubicite breastplate equivalent, some asset whose value depends entirely on the developers keeping the laws of physics stable? What's the social capital? Who are the nodes in the social network? Who do people trust? Who do they feel obligated to? Who can mobilize others to show up? What does guild membership confer? And what does it demand in return? And what's the cultural capital? How is expertise displayed and recognised? What does it look like, in this particular game, to be demonstrably good? And does that status confer anything beyond the game itself? Does it travel? And then the Malaby question. Are you seeing any of this being parlayed? Are players taking what they've built in the game and moving it into other contexts? Are they bringing things from outside, money, time, or real-world status, and deploying them inside? Burke's insight is that these virtual worlds are social simulations. Malaby's insight is that they're not simulations of something separate from real life. They are part of real life. The capital is real. The stakes are real. The economies are real. And the people playing are real people doing real things that have real consequences, both inside the game and beyond it. The play-work question is now in sharp focus. Burke's three economic populations, the maximisers, the moral economy faction, and the exploiters, each represent a different answer to the question of what one is doing when one plays. The maximisers treat the game as a competition with measurable outcomes. The exploiters treat it as a market. None of these is unambiguously playing, and none is unambiguously working. And when the eBay farmer sells a maximiser's accumulated virtual labour for real money, the labour-like quality of maximising becomes suddenly uncomfortably visible, which is exactly why the maximiser finds it disturbing. It reveals something they would prefer not to see about what they've been doing. Next week follows that revelation to its logical conclusion. If the eBay seller is the maximiser seen from the outside, the gold farmer is the maximiser seen from below, the worker who does for wages what the maximiser does for pleasure. It is a fluorescent lit office, 12 hours a night. The distinction between them is not primarily about what they do, it's about who they are and who they are allowed to be. So keep playing, keep noting, keep asking what is actually being produced here, and who is producing it, and where does it go?